The sheriff laughed when the old trucker climbed down from his rig. By nightfall, veterans were lining both sides of the highway, and not one of them was there for the sheriff. The town of Grover's Mill, Texas, sits at the junction of two county roads and one state highway, and it has the particular self-importance of small places that have been overlooked for so long they have begun to mistake resentment for authority. There is a grain elevator and a diner and a sheriff's station that shares a building with the post office, and on most mornings, the only traffic worth noticing is the trucks that pass through on Highway 87 without stopping. Cal Dempsey had been passing through without stopping for 11 years. He was 61 years old, and he drove a 2004 Peterbilt 379 that he had bought used and repaired himself over 2 winters in a rented garage outside Amarillo. The truck was maroon and gray, faded from years in the sun, with a slight shimmy in the front axle at highway speed that he had learned to accommodate rather than fix. The trailer behind it carried grain equipment, augers and bin covers, and the kind of unglamorous freight that kept the high plains running and that nobody ever photographed. He was a small-time independent operator. He had 4 regular clients and 1 fuel card and a logbook he kept in precise, unhurried handwriting that never had an error in it. He had a limp. It was his left leg, and it was not subtle. When he climbed down from the cab, he came down right leg first, and then brought the left leg after with a careful, deliberate motion, and then he walked with a gait that listed slightly to the right, as if the ground on his left side was not entirely to be trusted. He had walked this way for 19 years. He had stopped being self-conscious about it somewhere around year 3 and had stopped noticing it himself somewhere around year 8. Other people noticed it. Other people had always noticed it. He pulled into the Grover's Mill fuel stop at 9:20 on a Thursday morning in October, needing diesel and a cup of coffee and nothing else. He had made this stop dozens of times over the years. The woman at the register knew his order and had it ready before he was through the door. She was 60, gray-haired, and had the warm efficiency of someone who had been taking care of people for so long it had become indistinguishable from instinct. "Morning, Cal." "Morning, Dottie." "Large coffee, black, one of the sausage biscuits from the back." "You are a necessary person," he said. She smiled. He took the coffee and the biscuit to the small counter by the window and stood there looking out at the pump where his truck sat, taking on diesel. The sky was high and pale blue, the kind of October sky that promises cold later without delivering it yet. The fields around the town were gold and flat and enormous. He was halfway through the biscuit when the sheriff's cruiser pulled in. Sheriff Bud Hatch was 54 years old and had held the position for 9 years, winning each election by margins that reflected less his popularity than the absence of competition. He was a wide man who had been athletic once and was now simply large, and he had the particular manner of a person who has been the most powerful individual in a small place for long enough that he has forgotten what it felt like not to be. He climbed out of the cruiser, hitched his belt, and walked toward the fuel stop with the unhurried certainty of someone who owns the ground he walks on. He came through the door and looked around the way he always did. A sweep, territorial, checking the room against some internal register of what belonged there and what didn't. His eyes landed on Cal. "Dempsey," he said. "Sheriff." Hatch came to the counter not to stand beside him but to face him slightly, the way a person does when they intend a conversation to be a performance. He looked at Cal's coffee cup, then at Cal, then at the window where the Peterbilt sat at the pump. "That your rig?" "It is." "Saw you come off the highway. You were running a little wide on the turn into the lot." Cal looked at him for a moment. "It's a long trailer. The turn geometry requires it." Hatch smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, the kind that isn't for you. "You got your paperwork current?" "Always." "Mind if I take a look?" Cal set down the coffee cup. He walked to the door and pushed through it, and Hatch followed him out into the morning. Cal went to the cab and pulled the logbook and the registration and the insurance certificate from the dash and handed them through the window. Then he came back down, right leg first, left leg after. Hatch watched this. He watched the climb down with a particular quality of attention that was not concern and was not curiosity, but was something closer to entertainment. When Cal was standing on the ground, Hatch took the paperwork and looked through it at roughly the speed of a man who is not reading, but is simply being seen to read. "Long way to go with a bad leg," Hatch said, still looking at the papers. "My leg doesn't drive the truck," Cal said. Hatch looked up at him. Something sharpened in his expression, the way things sharpen when someone says something that was supposed to land and didn't. "That a smart answer?" "It's an accurate one." Hatch held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the logbook. He turned a page, turned it back, turned it again. "Your hour's here," he said, pointing. "Looks like you're running close to your limit." "I'm inside my limit by 2 hours. Close, though. Close and over are different things." Hatch closed the logbook and handed back the papers. Then he stood there for a moment in the way he sometimes stood, not quite finished, working something around. He looked at the Peterbilt, then at the trailer, then at Cal. "You know we've had some cargo theft on this corridor," he said. "Grain equipment, primarily. You match a description we've been circulating." Cal looked at him steadily. "What description?" "Independent operator, older, running this stretch regularly." "That describes a good portion of the freight drivers on Highway 87. Does describe you specifically, though." Hatch tilted his head slightly. "I'm going to need you to hold here while I run your plates." "You already know my plates. I've been stopping at this station for 11 years. "Then this won't take long." Hatch walked back to his cruiser. He sat inside it and appeared to look at something on his laptop. In the window of the fuel stop, Dottie had come to stand at the glass. Her expression was the expression of someone watching something unfair happen for the second or third time and not having enough power to stop it. Cal stood beside his truck and waited. He did not pace. He did not take out his phone. He stood the way a person stands when they have spent time in situations where visible agitation is a disadvantage and have learned, at a level below conscious decision, to be still. After 14 minutes, Hatch came back. "You're clear," he said. The tone was not an apology and was not designed to be. "I know I'm clear," Cal said. Hatch came a few feet closer. He looked at Cal with the smile again, the one that wasn't for anyone. "You know, I've seen a lot of drivers work this stretch who couldn't hack it long term. Physical wear, the kind of damage you're carrying." He glanced at Cal's leg. "It adds up. Road's hard on a healthy man." He paused. "Might want to think about something more suitable." Cal looked at him for a long moment. The morning was quiet around them. The fields stretched out in every direction, gold and indifferent. A single hawk moved in a long, slow circle above the grain elevator. "I appreciate your concern," Cal said. He turned back to the truck and climbed up into the cab. He heard Hatch say something to the empty air behind him. He did not look back to find out what it was. He pulled out of the fuel stop at 9:51 and merged back onto Highway 87 heading north. He drove for 40 minutes in silence. Then he reached across to the dash and picked up his phone and made a call. It rang 4 times. Then a man answered. "Cal." The voice was young and immediately alert, the voice of someone who picks up phones fast regardless of the hour. "Hey, Mitch. You good?" "I'm fine. Listen." Cal was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "I got held up in Grover's Mill this morning." "Hatch?" "Yeah." A pause. "You want me to?" "No. I just wanted you to know in case the window closes. I'll make it up on the back end of the drive." "You sure?" "I'm sure." Cal set the phone on the seat. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "Pale Rider still runs on time." He said it the way people say things to themselves that they learned a long time ago and have kept since. Not as a boast, not as a reminder, but as a kind of check, a reading. The way a pilot scans an instrument panel before takeoff, not because he expects a problem, but because the habit is the whole point. On the seat beside the phone was a road atlas, the paper kind, several years old, with certain routes marked in pencil. Not the main routes, but the alternates, the ones that went around rather than through. The pages for Texas were soft from use, and in the margins of several pages there were notes in the same precise handwriting as the logbook. Distances, grade changes, weight limits on certain county bridges, the kind of detail that a person accumulates when they have driven a territory for a very long time and have learned to think about it in full rather than in segments. He drove north. He did not know, could not have known, and would have had complicated feelings about, if he had, that in 3 towns and 2 counties along his route, people were making phone calls that had nothing to do with grain equipment or highway corridors. The first call came from a man named Erskine Webb, who ran a small engine repair shop outside Dalhart, and who had served 22 years in the Army before his knees made the decision for him. He was 67 years old, and he still kept his boots by the door out of a habit he saw no reason to break. He had met Cal Dempsey 6 years ago at a fuel stop in a rainstorm and had recognized something in the way the man carried himself, the way he moved through space with a particular economy, the way he looked at the exits when he entered a room, the way he did not fill silence with noise, and had, in the careful way of veterans, begun to ask questions. Not direct questions, the kind of questions that circle. Cal had answered in the same careful way, giving just enough for Erskine to understand what he was dealing with, and the two had been in irregular contact since. Erskine's call went to a man named Torres in Amarillo. Torres called a man named Dykeman in Lubbock. Dykeman called 3 people simultaneously. The calls moved out in a pattern that was not organized in any official sense, that had no chain of command and no formal structure, but that moved with the particular efficiency of a network built on shared experience rather than shared paperwork. By early afternoon, 17 people knew that Cal Dempsey had been held up in Grover's Mill by Sheriff Bud Hatch and spoken to in a manner that those 17 people found objectionable for reasons they did not need to explain to each other. Cal was unaware of all of this. He was eating a sandwich in the cab outside Dalhart, watching a line of cloud build on the northwest horizon and calculating whether it would reach the road before he cleared the next county. It would not. He drove through it clean. He made his delivery outside Stratford at 3:40 in the afternoon, 40 minutes inside the window he had promised the client. He unloaded, got the signature, strapped the empty trailer, and was back on the highway by 4:15. He would be back in Grover's Mill on his return route by early evening. He had not decided whether to stop at Dottie's again or push through. He was leaning toward pushing through. He was 10 miles north of Grover's Mill, coming down Highway 87 in the long amber light of late afternoon, when he saw the first one. A man standing on the shoulder of the highway, older, maybe 70, in a field jacket with a patch on the left sleeve. He was standing straight, hands at his sides, facing the road. Cal noticed him the way he noticed most things, without immediately categorizing, just taking it in. A man on the shoulder of the highway, probably fine. He passed, watching in the mirror. 2 miles further, another one. This man was younger, maybe 50, in civilian clothes with a ball cap, standing the same way, facing the road. Cal's hands were steady on the wheel. His expression did not change, but something in him became very still and very focused, the way it had in other times and in other places when things in the environment had begun to arrange themselves into a pattern he recognized. Another mile, another man, then 2 together, standing side by side, and as Cal's headlights swept over them in the fading light, he could see that one of them raised his hand. Not a wave. Something more deliberate. A held gesture. Cal slowed the Peterbilt. He did not stop immediately. He let the truck slow gradually over the next quarter mile, pulling the trailer smooth, and then he eased onto the shoulder and brought the rig to a stop in a wide section of gravel, and he sat there for a moment looking in his mirrors. In the driver's side mirror, he could see them coming. Not quickly, not in a rush, just walking toward the truck with the even, unhurried pace of people who have somewhere to be and have made their peace with getting there at whatever speed the terrain allows. He climbed down from the cab. He stood on the gravel shoulder in the cooling October air and waited. The sky was going amber and deep blue in the west, the sun already behind the horizon, the light still present, but no longer sourced. In both directions on the highway, he could see figures. Some had vehicles parked on the shoulder behind them. Some had come on foot from roads he couldn't identify. There were more than he had first counted. Erskine Webb was the first to reach him. He came from the south, moving with the rolling gait of bad knees managed through long practice. And when he got close enough, he stopped and stood for a moment, and the 2 men looked at each other. "Erskine," Cal said. Cal. Erskine's voice was level and unhurried. Heard you had a morning. Nothing I couldn't handle. I know you can handle it. Erskine was quiet for a moment. That's not why we're here. The others came and stood in ones and twos along the highway shoulder. They were not in formation. This was not that, was not trying to be that. They were simply present, in the way that a thing can be present without announcing itself. They ranged in age from maybe 30 to perhaps 80. Some wore field jackets, some wore plain clothes. Several wore ball caps with unit insignia that Cal recognized. One man, the oldest, had driven from somewhere that had put dust on his truck that didn't match the local soil, and he stood leaning on a wooden cane with the upright posture of someone who had decided a long time ago that his body's limitations were not his posture's problem. Cal stood among them and said nothing for a while. The highway was empty in both directions. The sky was going from amber to deep purple in the west. A man he didn't know, 40-something, thickly built, with a handshake that told you things, came up and introduced himself. Diekman, we served in the same theater, different units. You wouldn't know me. I appreciate you being here, Cal said. We know what you did on the Kandahar Road, Diekman said. It was said plainly, without drama, the way veterans state facts that civilians tend to dramatize. The whole convoy, all 16 men. Cal was quiet. They didn't give you what they should have given you, Diekman said. A lot of us know that. I didn't do it for what they'd give me. I know you didn't. A pause. That's why we're here instead of them. Erskine came back to his side and the two of them stood looking south down the highway toward the distant lights of Grover's Mill. Somewhere in that smear of light was the sheriff's station and its shared post office, and a man named Bud Hatch, who had watched Cal climb down from his truck that morning and had found in that climb something to laugh about. You want to tell me about the Kandahar Road? Erskine said, not pushing, just offering the space. Cal looked at the highway for a long time. Convoy was moving south, he said finally. November, night run. I was driving the third vehicle. The scout unit ahead of us had been out of contact for 6 minutes, which in that country and that time meant something specific. He paused. I saw the road geometry wrong before anyone else called it. Pulled the convoy left onto a secondary track, got 14 vehicles through before the primary route took a hit. He stopped. The 16th vehicle stalled on the transition. I went back. The highway was silent. You went back, Erskine said. Left leg caught a fragment on the return trip. Cal said it the way you describe a mechanical fact. No inflection, no performance. Nothing critical. I drove the vehicle out. That was the leg, Erskine said. That was the leg. They stood there in the cooling dark. Down the line of men along the shoulder, someone had lit a small lantern. Not flashlights, but an actual lantern, the old kind, and its warm light sat against the highway dark like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Cal turned and looked at the men on either side of him and behind him, stretched out along the highway in both directions. He looked at their faces in the growing dark, and for a moment something moved in his expression. Not the still, measured quality that was his ordinary face, but something that lived beneath it, rarely let out. Diekman stepped forward and held out his hand. In his palm was a small object, a patch, military, the kind cut from a uniform. Cal looked at it without touching it. Third convoy element, Diekman said. One of the 16. His family asked us to find you. Cal took the patch. He held it in his hand. It was worn at the edges, the color faded. It had been carried. He could tell by the feel of it that it had been carried for a while before it reached his hand, passed through several sets of hands, each set belonging to someone who understood what they were holding. He closed his hand around it. Erskine put a hand briefly on his shoulder, the same gesture, roughly, as the one in the photograph that Marina Vasquez kept in her glove box on a highway in Nevada, the gesture that veterans use when words would be accurate but insufficient. Cal nodded once. One by one, in the gathering dark, the men along the shoulder came to attention. Not in unison, they were not a unit, had no shared command, but in sequence, a ripple of straightening spines and stilled hands, moving down the highway shoulder like a slow wave. Several raised a hand in salute. Several simply stood straight. The old man with the cane squared his shoulders and lifted his chin. Cal stood among them on the shoulder of Highway 87 in the dark with the patch in his closed hand and looked at what had come to find him on an ordinary Thursday evening in October. He did not cry. He was not built for crying, and the people around him knew that and had not come here to see it. He simply stood and was seen, and the highway was quiet and the lantern burned. Later, after the men had gone back to their vehicles and their towns and their roads, Cal climbed back into the Peterbilt and sat in the dark cab for a while. He put the patch in the small tray above the dash where he kept his toll guitar pick he'd found in a parking lot years ago and had never thrown away for no reason he could name. He started the engine. He drove south toward Grover's Mill. He did not push through. He stopped at Dottie's for a second coffee, which she had ready before he was through the door. And he stood at the counter by the window and looked out at the highway and drank it slowly, and neither of them said much, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and they both knew it. He left a good tip. He walked back to the truck, right leg first, left leg after, and he drove out of Grover's Mill in the dark the same way he had driven in every time before, quietly, without announcement, leaving no particular mark on the place. The highway opened ahead of him, pale in the headlights, flat and long, and utterly indifferent to everything that had happened on its shoulder that evening. He drove it clean.